And as promised, joining us now is Senator Gregg from New Hampshire. And Senator, you've been doing a good work trying to change this bill into something that is halfway decent. Do you have any chance of doing that?
Doesn't look like it. We're getting amendments which make a tremendous amount of sense. For example, amendments that just simply reinforce what the president said the bill would do. For example, that no one under $200,000 of income would be taxed, that nobody's premium would go up, that special interest deals would be taken out, that Medicare savings would go to Medicare's rather than be used to create brand new entitlements. All those amendments are being voted down on a party line basis on the theory or the statement that they're dilatory and that they want to pass this bill and they don't want to have to send it back to the House. Of course, the constitutional process does require that it go back to the House if there is an amendment agreed to.
That went out the window a long time ago.
Yeah.
You know, what gets me, though, Senator, and the reason why I was so anxious to have you on is because you have been very explicit about the one thing that bothers all Americans about this, which is it is a dishonest piece to suggest that you can create a huge new government entitlement and save money is just at the core of it a dishonest proposition.
Well, you're absolutely right, and the American people intuitively understand that. They know that the government can increase its size by $2.6 trillion and not end up putting massive taxes on people, everybody, and in this instance, reducing Medicare by over $1 trillion when fully implemented and taking that money and creating new programs. And inevitably, what's going to happen here is a lot more debt is going to come onto our books. And it's a program that, from a fiscal standpoint, we can't afford. We're already on an unsustainable path.
Well, let me just, excuse me, Senator, let me just put up on the screen again. We showed the government spending as a percent of GDP, which I think is the figure that you're most interested in. And you can see it usually is around that 20% mark, but it zooms up in 2009 to almost 25% of GDP. And after this thing is over, it could go up easily to 30%, right?
That's absolutely right. And that's the problem. I mean, we cannot be a prosperous nation if the government is taking 30% out of the productive side of the economy. It just doesn't work. Because when you get government that large, there are only two ways to pay for it. One, you inflate the currency, and that obviously devalues the currency, and people lose their savings as a result of that. Or alternatively, you raise taxes to such a high level that you reduce and suffocate productivity because people no longer have any incentive to be productive.
Well, you mentioned the word,
and the money isn't in the market.
You mentioned the word incentives, and it leads me to ask you a question about the guys you were going to work for. You were going to work in the Obama administration, but when you look at some of the perverse incentives in this bill, I mean, we were talking before about how it costs, you get a $2,000 fine if you don't provide insurance for a worker, but you may be spending more than that now. So it's just, it behooves small business people to pay the fine and then send their employee off to the government for health insurance. Do these people in the administration understand incentives at all?
Yes, they do. They're trying to incentivize a national takeover, a nationalization of the health care delivery system in this country, and they know that the more people they force off of private insurance, either by doing what you talked about or by underpricing Medicaid and putting a lot more people on the Medicaid, so the actual cost of Medicaid for services has to be borne by the private sector, which picks up the cost of the doctor. Instead of Medicaid fully repaying the doctor's costs, the doctor has to shift cost over to his private clients, and thus premiums go up. The more they can drive up the premium on the private sector, the more people will drop insurance, the more people are pushed into the exchange, the more likely it is that you're going to get a momentum for what they really want, which is a single-payer nationalized system.
Well, they deny that charge up and down. The president, despite the fact that he said he was for it years ago, he says now that's not the plan. He's not for that. He understands the American people don't want it. You're suggesting that he's lying.
Well, I'm suggesting that there are people who understand that the way this thing is structured right now, we inevitably will make it very difficult for the private markets to work in the healthcare area, and there'll be more and more momentum, more and more push to bring a public sector solution in, because more and more people will be unhappy with their private markets because first, the prices will go up very significantly as a result of this cost shifting, and secondly, the interference with the private market will be dramatic from the government with the government intersecting most of your health care decisions that you have with a doctor. For example, if you're on Medicare, they're cutting Medicare by $1 trillion. most of that cut is going to come out of provider payments. So there are going to be a lot of doctors who simply drop out of the Medicare system, and people are going to become very frustrated by that.
We talked about that in the first segment. Doctors are going to suffer, and as a result, we're all going to suffer because there won't be enough to go around. However, what really gets me is what is going to happen to the economy. At some point, you and I know the economy will pop. It cannot sustain this kind of government spending. What happens now? Are we going to see a value-added tax like they have in Britain to pay for their health care? Are we going to see a debasing of the currency? All of the above? What?
Well, I don't know what we're going to see, but we're going to see it sooner rather than later because our debt is rising so fast that we're getting to one of those situations like you're seeing in some of your European nations. Now, we have the advantage of being a bigger economy, and we can monetize our debt for a fair amount of time. But when your debt crosses the 60%, in other words, public debt to GDP ratio exceeds 60%, you're in trouble. We're crossing 60% this year. We're going to be at 80 or 90% within 7 years. We're already seeing very significant signs from the market. The Chinese are saying things like they're concerned about our debt. Just this week, the most significant sign that I've seen recently is that Warren Buffett's debt is selling at a lower cost than Treasury debt. That's very serious. That never has happened, that the Treasury is not the debt of last resort and the safest debt out there. And so people are saying to us in the markets, hey, you've got to get your fiscal house in order. And instead of doing that, instead of getting your fiscal house in order, we're doing just the opposite. We're radically increasing the size of government by $2.5 trillion because, to be truthful, this administration and this Democratic Congress generally believes that growing the government significantly creates prosperity.
Yeah.
They don't seem to understand the fact that that's just the opposite of how you create prosperity.
By the way, how long do you think you would have lasted in an Obama administration?
Well, it was nice of them to invite me to join, and it was obvious that I wasn't a good fit.
I think that's pretty clear by now, yeah.
It was my mistake, and I take responsibility for not seeing it sooner.
All right. By the way, you're not running again. What are you going to do when you leave the Senate?
Whatever my wife tells me to do.
She'll be patting you on the head for that one tonight. Thank you very much for coming in, Senator. Please come back and see us again. Judge Gregg from New Hampshire.
My pleasure. Thank you.